Welcome to Second Take, the show that takes a look at the issues behind the news. The damage limitation following the signing of a nuclear agreement between the Department of Energy and Rosatom continued this week. Terence Creamer joins me to outline some of the latest developments. Hi, Terence.
Rational.
How has the DoE framed the agreement between South Africa, the Russian Federation and Rosatom?
Well, it was initially when the press releases came out from both Rosatom and the DoE, they mimicked each other. There was a lot of confusion because it looked like a deal had been struck overseas and that 8 VVER reactors that Rosatom supplies were going to be built to supply 9,600 megawatts of nuclear energy capacity in South Africa. The DoE claims that that was never the intention, to say that there would be a Russian reactors being built in South Africa, but rather they're framing it as an intergovernment agreement. And they're saying that a number of the intergovernmental agreements are going to be struck or have been struck, not only in the nuclear energy space, but also outside. But in the nuclear space, they've done one already with the South Koreans. They're going to be doing one with the French in October. And it looks like there's also going to be discussions with the Chinese, the Japanese, and the US, which are all vendor countries for nuclear equipment. So they're saying, and this is part of a preparatory phase for an eventual procurement process for the capacity that we're wanting to add into our energy mix in the form of nuclear energy. And that procurement process has not started, and that the form of that process is still to be determined. So what these framework agreements are really about is to get an insight from those governments or from those vendor companies as to what their offering could look like should a procurement process take shape. And that would then inform the government, which has set up this Energy Security Cabinet Subcommittee, as to what would be in South Africa's best interest in terms of the form that a procurement process could take.
Why has the content of the agreement not been made public, and do you think the details will ever be revealed?
Yeah, I think that it's a difficult one to understand. I think usually these framework agreements are fairly broad-based and fairly bland and cover lots of elements of cooperation. And it seems like these nuclear ones do that, but they go a little bit further in the sense that the Russian Federation or the South Korean government or the Chinese government or the French in the future will be outlining a little bit more as to what their offering might look like, what the value proposition of their nuclear offering to South Africa could look like, and what it would mean for the different elements that South Africa is very keen on. So South Africa is keen on a full fuel cycle, for instance, so not just having nuclear reactors that produce electricity, but because we are a uranium mining country, beneficiating that uranium into nuclear fuel in a fuel cycle, and using that fuel both inside South African reactors and potentially outside of the country in the form of exports. Also wanting to build a nuclear industry, so having localization and industrialization around the program, that's a big element. And I think that's where some of the confusion came with the Rosatom announcement as well, because there was a specific figure of, I think, $10 billion given. And that seems to be Russia's sort of baseline offer in terms of building the capacity of the South African industry to supply into a nuclear build program. They feel that sort of investment might need to be made to support such a process. And there's other elements that government is very keen on around job creation, building skills, high-level skills, technical skills in nuclear, as well as technology transfer. Now, some countries and vendors can maybe offer that, and others may not be able to offer. So the preparatory phase in these agreements is about what the offer could look like. And the rationale for not releasing this information, which I think has raised a lot of suspicion, is really to say it's at the first signatory shouldn't be disadvantaged in any way. So because the South Koreans and the Russians have signed first, and then we publicize, say, the Rosatom offer or the South Korean offer, it gives the later signatories some insight into what they're going to be proposing to South Africa, which could maybe be trumped in later documents. I don't think that's going to be satisfactory in the robust sort of democracy and noisy democracy that we have in South Africa. And I think eventually people are going to want to see that content. I think there might be an acceptance that Cabinet maybe needs to approve the release of all the documents at maybe a single time. But if they don't get released, I think we're going to see something of a bun fight and a political, intervention. We've already seen the leader of the Democratic Alliance saying that Premier Herenzilla would like to see this document and what is the content, and so that suspicions can be allayed. And I can imagine that once all the different deals are signed or framework agreements are signed, there's going to be a clamour to see this documentation before we start entering any sort of procurement phase.
What form is the eventual procurement process likely to take?
I think again it's really quite blurred in this area, and this is, I think, worrying a lot of people because South Africa has a procurement framework which really is about having a competitive bidding process in most areas. So having rivalry, having a transparent, equitable, open process that people can sort of interrogate, that there's some sort of basis, whether it's price, all those other elements I mentioned around security of supply and getting the fuel cycle in. There should be some sort of visibility of what the offer entails. And I think one of the worrying aspects of the communication post the Russian Federation, South Africa, DoE signing of this frame agreement is that there's an indication that it might not go through a normal competitive bidding route. And I think that's, again, raising alarm bells. And they're emphasizing, overemphasizing, in my mind, this fact that nuclear is something of a different beast and that it needs to maybe be treated differently. And therefore they sort of flagged, yes, there could be an open tender process, or there could be a closed tender process, whatever that might mean. It might be similar to what Eskom did with Nuclear One tender, which was eventually aborted, which was to have just two vendors bidding. They also raised this prospect of a government-to-government arrangement. Again, that's very fuzzy. What does that mean? It seems to be some sort of arrangement where maybe the government would be of the vendor companies. That government might be the procurer and pass that benefit on to South Africa, sort of a cost price, but to sort of get the South African industry really totally embedded into that technology so that there's a future horizon for commercial spin-offs. But that is, again, I think it's fuzzy, and I think once there is a decision around the procurement process, I would imagine that if we do not go the fully competitive open tender route, there are going to be a lot of suspicions, and it's going to be a massive PR exercise to manage. There's going to have to be very clear reasons given as to why we don't go with an open or even a closed tender process where we select a couple of bidders, and why we're going for some other model. And I also think it opens up the whole nuclear procurement process to probably legal challenge, and I'm sure there are organizations already wondering whether they shouldn't try first access the documents of Rosatom, but maybe beyond that, look at if an announcement is made around the procurement process, challenging the way that procurement is managed. So I think we've got a long way to go in this whole nuclear procurement. The framework agreements, it seems, will all be signed probably by the end of the year or early next year. And then it really is up to government to make a decision. And I think one piece of solace that we got yesterday was that the DoE committed to having the integrated resource plan updated before any procurement process goes ahead, because the current version, which proposes 9,600 megawatts of nuclear by 2030, is not only out of date, it's unrealistic. We haven't even started a procurement process, never mind getting all the other regulatory and legal systems in place to allow for a nuclear procurement as well as a building of a nuclear power station. You can imagine just the environmental considerations and consultations that are going to need to happen when a site is chosen for these first reactors. It's going to take a long time. And I think there's going to be a clamour for greater transparency. There's now high levels of suspicion, and I think unless government manages this in a very transparent way, I think we're going to see that this could be one of the most contentious procurement processes since the arms deal, but maybe even larger than that.
Thank you. That's the Second Take show for this week. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time for more news analysis.